you?
Yeah, I have some questions about atrazine, a pesticide.
Okay.
Um, are they putting chemicals in the water to turn the frogs gay?
Is this a prank call?
No.
Okay. Ay.
Hey, it's been a while. If you follow me on Twitter, you might know that a few months ago I tweeted a sneak peek of what I've been working on. That's right, gay frogs. Why have I spent the last 3 months of my life researching gay frogs, you ask? Well, I love it when silly bullshit ends up being true. So was Alex Jones right about gay frogs? That's what we're going to investigate in this video here.
Wake up, wake up, snap out of it, snap out of it. You have been under cult brainwashing. Come out of it. You've got to get moving. You've got to get aggressive. You've got to get mad. You've got to get focused. You've got to get crazed. You got to get motivated, man. We are under attack.
The date was October 16th, 2015. While ranting about a globalist takeover and leftist psyops, Alex Jones rapidly listed off ways in which he believes we are under chemical and biological attack.
Everything they give us is to hurt us. Shock claim, world's on the brink of 50-year ice age. Scientists claim zapping brains with magnets can treat belief in God. Yeah, so can giving somebody a lobotomy. Did parallel universe open up? 100-sea floating city filmed in skies above China. That's mainstream news. Was videotaped. And it's clearly a giant 500-yard tall, wide hologram. Now, there it is, the gay bomb. Look it up for yourself. I mean, this is what they're... What do you think tap water is? It's a gay bomb, baby. And I'm not saying people didn't naturally have homosexual feelings. I'm not even getting into it, quite frankly. I mean, give me a break. You think I am like, shocked by it, so I'm up here bashing it because I don't like gay people? I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Serious crap. I'm sick of being social engineered. It's not funny.
Something that struck me while watching the full broadcast was that although it's the quote that Alex Jones is most known for, he spends no more than 10 seconds on the topic of gay frogs. He just sort of peppers it into his rant and moves on without offering any sort of explanation. I guess that's why it's so memorable, because it's baffling how angry he gets, and it just seems to come out of nowhere. If I was going to be able to find out whether or not he's right about chemicals in the water turning frogs gay, then I needed more context. Luckily, he clarified his statement to Vine sensation Logan Paul.
Now, is this the gay frog that you were talking about?
No, this is not the atrazine gay frogs. By the way, you pull up major universities, folks, and I'm not against gay people. The point is that atrazine artificially demasculates men, it over-feminizes women, and causes cancer.
And where is that found? Where's the whatever you're saying?
Atrazine is basically in all of our tap water. It's in everything. We're just inundated in it.
So you believe
Don't believe me. Don't believe me. I was covering like 10 years ago a Berkeley study and then a South African study and a UT study going, wow, look, almost all the frogs don't now want females. They want to have sex with males who don't produce eggs, so the frogs are dying. And I said, it's making the frickin' frogs gay.
So the chemical that Alex Jones was referring to is called atrazine. It's used mostly on cornfields to eradicate broadleaves. Atrazine gets into the drinking water through agricultural runoff. An estimated 33 million Americans have been exposed to atrazine through their taps, according to data from water systems nationwide. In 2003, it was banned in the European Union. A wide range of studies have identified atrazine as a possible human carcinogen and an endocrine disruptor. In frogs, it's been associated with increased estrogen production, decreased fertility, gonadal deformities, altered sex ratios, complete sex reversal, and hermaphroditism. In 2002, a Berkeley endocrinologist named Dr. Tyrone Hayes published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called Hermaphroditic Demasculinized Frogs After Exposure to the Herbicide Atrazine at Low Ecologically Relevant Doses. Here's a clip I found of Dr. Tyrone Hayes explaining his work.
Hayes is testing the effects of chemicals like atrazine, a common herbicide.
We have a whole family of animals where we've eliminated the female chromosome.
Specimen 01.
These animals that we know are genetic males have been exposed to atrazine for their entire life. And many of these genetic males now are turning into females. You can see he's got eggs that kind of look like they're in a sac. These are actually yolked eggs ready to be laid. What's happening is you're skewing sex ratios. You can get genetic bottlenecking, which can cause crashes. And quite frankly, if you're a genetic male, it'd be nice if you developed as a genetic male. And now we have a chemical very common in the environment that's effectively sex-reversing animals.
So, does atrazine turn frogs gay? Honestly, there's not much evidence that it does.
Look, here's the thing.
Fine. Listen,
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm kind of retarded.
Although Hayes has reported such findings, he's never published any research about gay frogs. Instead of gay frogs, his published research shows that low doses of atrazine can cause feminization of male frogs. Feminization refers to hermaphroditism, intersex, full sex reversal, and eggs inside of testes. Tyrone Hayes is known for studying the endocrine disrupting effects of atrazine, especially the feminizing and chemically castrating effects. He has published his peer-reviewed research to top-rated journals for decades now, and is a well-respected scientist and professor, so why not believe him? Well, that's because on Wikipedia it says that no one has been able to replicate his work. Additionally, it says that the US Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, reviewed his work and concluded that atrazine doesn't negatively impact amphibians. Well, Tyrone Hayes had research that showed that, it feminizes frogs, so he was finding intersex frogs and...
Yeah, I'm familiar with his research actually, but it was never able to be verified, so I think that people are not really sure what exactly the element was in his experiments that were causing that sex changeover. But I mean, it's definitely interesting, and people have numerous researchers have attempted to, re-verify his results, but they have not been able to.
Now, this seemed strange to me. From what I knew from my own research, there are plenty of studies showing that atrazine does in fact have adverse effects on amphibians. So is it possible that these two regulatory agencies are wrong? To find out more, I contacted 3 scientists, all of whom were on the EPA Scientific Advisory Panel during the risk assessment of atrazine. Their names are Daniel Schlenk.
I had a different guy call me up one day and say, "Dude, am I gonna turn into a girl?"
Jason Rohr.
I just happened to focus in on atrazine early in my career because it regularly produced results that were different from the traits of animals in my control treatments.
And David Skelly. So, for your own field studies, you found hermaphroditic frogs in suburbia, right?
Oh yeah.
In our meta-analysis, I believe that we did find support. It just wasn't always consistent. But that was also almost certainly a function of the fact that the feminization results drew much, much more attention from Syngenta. Syngenta wasn't a fan of Tyrone. Tyrone wasn't a fan of Syngenta. And so I think there was a lot more effort being put by Syngenta to come up with counter examples to Tyrone's studies. There are data suggesting that atrazine may have effects on reproductive organs of humans, and so frogs are not humans, but they are vertebrates. They have a lot of similar traits as humans. Not all, but there are some similar traits, and I think Syngenta was very worried that there might be concerns that humans might have offspring that either have both types of gonads, ovaries and testes, or that their male offspring would have female traits. And I think that's a scary thing for a lot of parents, and unquestionably something that Syngenta would want to avoid.
Do I think that Syngenta was concerned about the PR outfall? I cannot tell you, but I can tell you what they did, and what they did was they tried to really destroy his career, in my opinion. And I think that was really wrong. It totally affected the way he did science. It totally affected his lab. I mean, I don't think he took any graduate students after that because he was afraid for what that would do to their careers because they came out of his lab. I mean, it's very common for industry to fight back on results that show something damaging.
In this video, I'm going to explain to you why the EPA's conclusion that atrazine has no adverse effects is purposely misleading. But first, let's start from the beginning. The year was 1997, and Tyrone Hayes was kind of a hotshot. After developing a screening test which detected hormonal disruption, his work caught the eyes of Syngenta, who contracted his laboratory through a financial conduit called EcoRisk to examine the endocrine-disrupting effects of atrazine on amphibians. After running some experiments, Tyrone Hayes found that atrazine could disrupt the sexual development of frogs, starting at doses as low as 0.1 parts per billion.
So at any rate, we did some studies where we just exposed frogs to ecologically relevant, to levels of atrazine that you might find in the environment. And we literally just asked, our hypothesis was, does it do anything?
In laboratory studies, Hayes observed reduced larynxes in 80% of male frogs, and 20% of them developed into hermaphrodites with both testes and ovaries.
Here's testis, which males should have. But then this guy's got some ovaries. He's got another large testis. He's got some more ovary. There's a whole party going on in there. He ain't even got to leave the house. But that's not normal. All I mean is that frogs are not naturally hermaphroditic. And people get confused. Somebody always asks me, aren't frogs naturally hermaphroditic? Who knows where that comes from? Jurassic Park, yeah, somebody always. So apparently in the Jurassic Park, frog DNA made the dinosaurs change sex. That's science fiction.
When Hayes shared his work with Syngenta, he says that they tried to stall his progress and bury his results. According to him, they cut his funding, brought in statisticians to nitpick his data, refused to share his research with the EPA, and frequently said that there needed to be further testing.
And then it seemed like they were trying to slow down the progress, and because with each set of samples that we analyzed, the problem got worse. It didn't get better. And then eventually, then they asked me to manipulate the data in ways that were inappropriate to try to make it go away. And at that point, I quit. At that point, I left the contract.
He claims that Syngenta offered him $2 million to stay and conduct his research in private, but that he refused. After collecting funding, Hayes conducted studies in his lab and on the field. 2 years later, he published his work in 2 prestigious journals, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Nature. Syngenta Crop Protection retaliated by going into full damage control mode. They funded studies and put out a press release claiming that 3 separate studies by university scientists have failed to replicate his work. At the same time, there were other studies being published which backed up Hayes' findings that atrazine is an endocrine disruptor. In 2002, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced that it would conduct a risk assessment to assess atrazine's eligibility for re-registration. This took place around the same time that Tyrone Hayes published his research. Under a consent decree issued in court by the Natural Resources Defense Council, the EPA was required to review the available literature on atrazine's effects on amphibians and to convene a scientific advisory panel made up of independent scientists to help evaluate and peer-review studies. The EPA's risk assessment was largely focused on one question: at what concentrations does atrazine have adverse effects to amphibian gonadal development, and is it below ecologically relevant levels? There were 2 official risk assessments of atrazine's effects on amphibians in total, one in 2003 and the final one in 2007. During both of these risk assessments, the EPA did everything in its power to aid the primary registrant of atrazine, Syngenta, in keeping atrazine on the market. Let me explain how. During the first risk assessment in 2003, the EPA's review wasn't comprehensive. It was limited to 17 studies in total. Out of those 17 studies, 12 of them were funded by Syngenta, and only 2 of them found no adverse effects. After reviewing these studies, the EPA concluded that although there is sufficient evidence to formulate a hypothesis that atrazine exposure may impact gonadal development in amphibians, there is currently insufficient data to confirm or refute the hypothesis. Okay, so here's where the fuckery starts. Then the EPA said that they required additional studies, especially one that could replicate Tyrone Hayes' research. And guess who they relied on to conduct these studies? Well, Syngenta Crop Protection, of course. Not only was Syngenta responsible for testing its own product, it also put together a list of good laboratory practices, which all studies subsequently had to follow in order to be considered by the EPA. The EPA even admits in its 2007 amphibian white paper that it was Syngenta who provided the agency with the signed and finalized version of the study protocol. Sure, the EPA made decisions here and there, but they pretty much just left it up to Syngenta to create these test protocols based on their recommendations. This occurred after a former tobacco lobbyist and anti-regulation czar named Jim Tozy used a 2-sentence rider called the Data Quality Act, which he authored, by the way, and he used it to throw a wrench into the EPA's regulatory process of atrazine. The Data Quality Act is often used by special interest groups to challenge the legitimacy of scientific studies, which is exactly what happened in the case of atrazine. Citing the Data Quality Act, Tosi petitioned the EPA saying two things. One, that they don't have validated test methods for determining whether or not atrazine causes endocrine disruption. Two, he wrongly argued that the findings that atrazine caused endocrine effects had not been reproduced in any other studies. Anyway, so, the EPA then told Syngenta to create the testing methods and to conduct their own studies. After running two parallel tests and submitting them as one study, Syngenta returned to the EPA with the results. And lo and behold, Syngenta found that atrazine had no adverse effects. Because Syngenta collaborated with the EPA in designing the Good Laboratory Practice protocols for assessing hormonal disruption in frogs, the EPA then said that every study has to follow those protocols, and any study that doesn't is going to be thrown out. The Environmental Protection Agency then threw out every single study in the open literature because they did not meet those Good Laboratory Practice protocols. Even studies conducted before the Good Laboratory Practice guidelines were set by Syngenta were retroactively considered to be either qualitative or invalid by the EPA. That's 36 studies in total, which suddenly don't meet the criteria to be considered robust enough to be used to make a regulatory decision. And the only reason they weren't considered robust enough is because they didn't follow these protocols made by Syngenta. So in the end, before the EPA made their conclusion in 2007, only one study remained that was considered to be quantitative and eligible to be the basis of a regulatory decision. And that study was funded by Syngenta Crop Protection.
What we could talk about for a minute that might be helpful, though, is this good laboratory practice business.
Yeah. So explain that.
Well, I evidently don't do good laboratory practice. What it's allowed industry and kind of naysayer people to say is, well, they don't do good laboratory work. We do.
It's a misnomer, right?
What's that?
It's a misnomer.
Well,
to call it good laboratory practices when it's just checks and balances, basically. So they don't...
Yeah, it's being used to tar and feather people who don't have the money to do the work the way that industry does. But the fact of the matter is that you can do everything that it says in a good laboratory practice manual and have garbage science.
So on the basis of a single Syngenta-funded study, which was a complete outlier finding virtually no adverse effects even at high doses of atrazine, the EPA concluded in 2007 that atrazine causes no adverse effects on frogs and that no additional testing was warranted to address the issue. EPA convened a scientific advisory panel made up of independent experts to help them form a conclusion. However, the EPA didn't really have to accept their advice, and a lot of their advice was not even considered. In 2016, the EPA released a draft of their refined ecological risk assessment for atrazine. Unlike in 2007, where their conclusion was formed on the basis of a single Syngenta-funded study, in 2016 they included 55 studies from the open literature that were previously designated as qualitative and therefore dismissed. Based on a weight of evidence analysis which included these studies, they concluded that atrazine has possible risk to the metamorphosis, growth, and sexual development of amphibians. So at least they eventually acknowledged it. Yet on their website, it still says that atrazine has no adverse effects. Same goes for Syngenta, who still touts the EPA's 2007 conclusion as scientific fact. In 2007, they determined it a closed discussion. Like, we're not going to look into it anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean...
I heard about that. Yes.
In that case, it just seems like...
Yeah, I was not very happy with that. So, I disagree with that approach. That's my opinion on that. In fact, I was a little bit upset that they didn't adhere to our recommendation to do multiple species and include the weight of evidence. But we're there to provide advice. They're there to make the decision.
I remember the result very well. I don't think anybody on the panel, certainly I wasn't very happy with the idea that EPA hadn't funded the studies themselves and done them. The EPA has a beautiful laboratory in Duluth where they do exposure studies. I have no idea why, and you know, in aquatic systems, I know some of the people who work there. I don't know why on earth they didn't have those people do that work. I have nothing to tell you. I don't get it. It didn't make sense, and you know, it felt absolutely wrong that they had done it this way.
Is it a common practice for the EPA to require multiple labs to replicate the findings of a single lab? I would say no, because it only used a single Syngenta-funded study to evaluate the safety of atrazine. If they want to apply that policy to Tyrone, then it should be evenly applied to the Syngenta study, and they should have had an independent third party evaluate whether they could replicate the findings of Syngenta. So I don't know the answer definitively, but if they're going to have that be a policy, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, I think it would be a reasonable policy. It needs to be evenly applied to industry as well as to academics.
So we find out, and this is happening to you, so you're aware of it, where it becomes more broadly known is in a lawsuit, a class action suit against Syngenta in 2012, which they eventually settled for over $100 million with communities in Illinois over water. But in that process, in the discovery process, the notes of Syngenta and their records become public, and we find there that they, that they had written down and had records. And I was going through some of that, and it says they made a list of ways to discredit you. And those lists included have your work audited, ask journals to retract your articles, and this is all their language, set trap to entice him to sue.
That's my favorite, set a trap. Who writes that down, right?
Yeah.
Set a trap.
Set trap.
It's like Bugs Bunny Road Warriors.
Yeah, no one will ever read this. Investigate your funding and even investigate your wife.
In 2011, Syngenta's internal documents were released by the Madison County Circuit Court in response to a Freedom of Information Act request by investigative journalist Claire Howard. These documents showed that Syngenta discussed ways to destroy Tyrone Hayes' career and credibility. Strategies included investigate his wife, tap his phone calls, set him up, purchase Tyrone Hayes as a search word on the internet and direct searches to their own marketing materials, offer him unlimited research funds, and the commissioning of a psychiatric profile on Hayes, which refers to Hayes as a paranoid schizo and narcissist. Notes from one memo reads, if TH, Tyrone Hayes, is involved in a scandal, the Enviros will drop him. Another note read, can prevent citing of Tyrone Hayes' data by revealing him as non-credible. Additionally, Syngenta hired a detective agency to investigate scientists on the EPA's Scientific Advisory Panel. They looked into the personal life of a judge, and they paid 130 experts to appear as independent supporters without disclosing ties to the company. Syngenta's internal documents show that they routinely paid these experts to appear in the media and support the safety of atrazine. Documents show that people on this list were coached, and that their statements in support of atrazine were edited by the company. Court documents include an email dated October 28, 2009, from a Syngenta employee asking her boss how to pay these third-party allies who write in support of atrazine. Don Corsi, a Meritech professor of public policy at the University of Chicago, who received $500 an hour from Syngenta to make media appearances supporting the necessity of atrazine. Stephen Milloy, publisher of JunkScience.com and president of Citizens for the Integrity of Science, was also in Syngenta's support of third-party stakeholders database. In a letter dated August 6, 2008, Milloy requested a $25,000 grant for the nonprofit Free Enterprise Project of the National Center for Public Policy Research. He writes, send the check to me as usual, and I'll take care of it. A PR company called the White House Writers Group, based in Washington, D.C., received more than $1.6 million in 2010 and 2011 to write op-ed pieces in favor of atrazine. Another PR firm called Jane Thomas & Associates, which is based in Chicago, devised a plan to send trained critics to Tyrone Hayes' speaking events to disrupt, intimidate him, and question his science. If you want to learn more about Syngenta's secret campaign, I'm mostly citing from a website called 100 Reporters from an article by Claire Howard. You can find that in the description box below. Before I end this video, I need to address a certain elephant in the room. And that's the question of Hayes' credibility. When I first started working on this topic, I watched a 3-part series from a YouTuber and skeptic named Miles Power. In his video, he says that Hayes never provided data to the EPA. And it's not really surprising because if you look at Miles Power's sources, you'll see that most of them come from known agrochemical company shills or just straight from Syngenta's website. Here's what Hayes says about his data.
At this point, I was talking to the EPA. You'll read some weird stuff online that I never shared my data. The EPA was in my lab watching me collect data. They had a statistician who reanalyzed all of my raw data. They were right there. The company made that stuff up.
Now, I can't prove that Hayes shared his data, but I can show you why I suspect that this is a misleading talking point manufactured by Syngenta's PR team with the help of some members of the EPA. This point stems from a statement made by an EPA representative in 2005 named Ann Lindsay, while she testified before the Agricultural and Rural Development Committee of the Minnesota House of Representatives. She said, quote, Dr. Hayes claims that not only his laboratory has repeated the findings many times in experiments with thousands of frogs, but that other scientists have also replicated his results. EPA, however, has never seen either the results from any independent investigator published in peer-reviewed scientific journals or the raw data from Dr. Hayes' additional experiments. Now, this seems pretty damning until you realize that within her same testimony, she said, quote, Dr. Hayes published the first report of his scientific research in 2002. In 2003, EPA began to collect all scientific studies that examined the potential effects of atrazine on various species of frogs, including all of the studies published by Tyrone Hayes. As part of its efforts to understand the available data, EPA scientists visited Dr. Tyrone Hayes' lab and reviewed some of his raw data. So, which is it? Now, here's something suspicious that I found. While I was looking through Syngenta's internal documents, I noticed Ann Lindsay's name written 3 times. As you can see here, it says, check if we sent Lindsay testimony. On another page, it says, is Ann Lindsay prepared to speak to reporters? And again, Lindsay testimony. Of course, I'm speculating here, but I don't know, it seems very fishy. In 2010, the US EPA wrote to Dave Winters, a state representative who requested clarification about Tyrone Hayes' data. In this letter, the EPA said, quote, in your letter, you asked whether EPA received from Dr. Hayes a complete, transparent set of raw data which could be interpreted and analyzed by the EPA and used in generating a full evaluation of his work. In addition, you asked whether EPA was in agreement with Dr. Hayes' findings. In response to your first question, I regret that the EPA science staff in the Office of Pesticide Programs, EFED, could not properly account for the sample sizes and study design reportedly used by the Berkeley researchers. As a result, we were unable to complete any independent analysis to support the study's conclusions. This letter does not say that Hayes refused to provide his data. It says that the EPA was unable to properly account for the sample sizes or experimental design. It is a statement which is intentionally vague and allows for multiple interpretations, some sinister and some mundane. It can refer either to the reproducibility of Hayes' results or the ability of the EPA to replicate those results. But nowhere does it say that he refused to share his results. In other words, it's a diplomatic way of saying that they did not attempt to replicate his experiment, but that there are other experiments which may or may have not contradicted Hayes' results. Hayes' research and hermaphroditic frogs are a small part of a much larger story. For the sake of time, I left out a lot of things, such as the carcinogenic effects of atrazine, the class action lawsuit in 2010, which Syngenta lost because of persistent atrazine contamination in drinking water, and I didn't even get to talk about how atrazine exposure is associated with higher rates of micropenises in boys. When I embarked on this journey to see if Alex Jones was right about gay frogs, I didn't know at the time that it would reveal itself to be a complex tale of corporate malfeasance, bureaucratic corruption, and scientific manipulation. So here's what I learned. First, for Alex Jones' statement about gay frogs to be right, he should have said, the herbicide atrazine gets into the water through agricultural runoff and sometimes turns frogs into hermaphrodites. Although I suppose that's not as memorable as,
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
Second, I learned a lot about the product defense industry, which specializes in scientific uncertainty campaigns. If a product is on the market and scientific studies are published showing that it has adverse effects, what typically happens is that the registrant of that product will try to delay regulation for as long as they possibly can. In doing so, they will manufacture doubt by commissioning their own contradictory studies, which they then show to policymakers as proof that the science is still uncertain. Then policymakers will often aid industry by giving them their stamp of approval, while assuring the public that they've tested the product and deemed it safe. This is business as usual. Just look into the ineffectual regulatory history of DDT, Teflon, climate change, or fracking. There are multiple layers to this issue. It's not just that corporations are bad and evil, man. Really, it's systemic. Federal agencies like the EPA are in the pockets of big corporations. Legislation is enacted that enables business interests to slow or prevent regulation completely, such as the Halliburton loophole, which made fracking exempt from regulation by the EPA. Unethical scientists are willing to aid corporations in distorting the truth by producing studies not meant to advance science, but instead to support companies in policy and legal quagmires. And much of the general public doesn't have the time or expertise to know what's safe or who to trust. Truth is central to this story. I'm not an activist, and I don't even think that atrazine should be banned. My issue is with blatant dishonesty. When institutions lie to us, who can we rely on to expose the truth? If regulatory bodies like the EPA are so compromised by political and financial conflicts of interest, who can we depend on to ensure that human interests don't take a backseat to economic growth and product sales? Additionally, how do we maintain the type of economic growth which our modern consumer lifestyles depend on without severe costs to human health and the environment? Sadly, I don't have the answers to these questions. After looking at this story and many similar to it, my opinion is that most corporations cannot be trusted to weigh public health over short-term financial gain, and they definitely shouldn't be solely relied on to test the safety of their products. All I know now is that if a product poses a risk to the public, it's unlikely that most corporations will be forthright about it.
Let me begin my questioning on the matter of whether or not nicotine is addictive. Let me ask you first, and I'd like to just go down the row, whether each of you believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it, and just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no, and again, time is short. If you could just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
All right.
Okay, so thanks for agreeing to talk to us. We have two clips prepared for you today. We're going to show you the first one, and then I'm going to come back. I'm going to ask you some questions about it. And then after that, we have a follow-up clip, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about that. So Mira is going to come here and show you the clip.
Yeah, there it is, the gay bomb. Look it up for yourself. I mean, this is what do you think tap water is? It's a gay bomb, baby. And I'm not saying people didn't naturally have homosexual feelings. I'm not even getting into it, quite frankly. I mean, give me a break. You think I am like, shocked by it, so I'm up here bashing it because I don't like gay people? I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
All right, go in there. Okay. All right. So can you tell me about what you just watched?
It was about gay bombs and turning the water gay, like putting chemicals into the water. Like I don't understand.
Think he knows what he's talking about.
What he's saying is there's chemicals in the water. The government is putting chemicals in the water that are turning the freaking frogs gay. That's it.